All right, so this thing they're going to call the Civil War has just broken out. A whole bunch of guys have signed up to fight, and they've all brought with them not just their luggage, but their local germs. So there's all sorts of diseases brewing in the camps. Stomach flus, measles, chickenpox. And remember, not only do they not have antibiotics, they barely even have clean water. No one's washing their hands or anything. So the Army doc is treating guys with dysentery, bronchitis, cuts and bruises from training, making do with stuff that hardly qualifies as medication. Oh, and don't forget the actual war going on out there. They're going to bring in soldiers with gunshot wounds by the dozens. Welcome to a day in the life of a Civil War medic. Let's roll back a bit. With men enlisting in the Army by the thousands, you needed doctors. The problem is, doctors need education. So when all the trained professionals were already out in the field, the Army looked for new recruits. And these eager medics-to-be found themselves on an accelerated training schedule. When they finally made it out with the troops, they were just about equivalent to a second-year medical student. Talk about having to learn on the job. These doctors found themselves working out in the front lines in field hospitals, and they were pretty makeshift. The lucky ones could take over existing buildings. You might find medics working out of what was once a school or a hotel. More often, field hospital was literal, built up in cleared fields filled with tents and sheds. These were the hardest working conditions. With no running water, hygiene was harder to maintain, and cross-contamination between patients was inevitable. Most importantly, water was for drinking and cooking. The water that was used for cleaning was probably scooped out of a nearby pond and got used and reused until you couldn't see through it. Yuck. That's one thing for mopping the mud off the floor, something else entirely for scrubbing down the table where you're treating soldiers. There was never a dull moment in the day for the docs. As soldiers traveled south, they were exposed to all sorts of diseases they had no natural immunity against. Things like dysentery, which spread through contaminated water, a huge problem, or malaria from mosquitoes. These diseases, alongside more commonplace ones like measles, were treated with many things. Even though medicine had no antibiotics, they did have ways to treat what ailed you. In many ways, it was more about treating the symptoms. Bowel problems were common and serious. Diarrhea puts a man at serious risk by death by dehydration. If you came to the doctor with this complaint, he'd give you quinine. This was also a handy cure for malaria. Dysentery was such a problem amongst the soldiers. The treatments like quinine or tinctures were sometimes worse than the illness, and this was a time before pills were common. So most doctors stocked their meds as powders to be dispensed and mixed in water. But in the field hospitals, they didn't bother with precise measurements. Close enough was good enough. Seems like a recipe for an upset stomach to me. Oh, and you can't forget what they would have prescribed for your pain. The 3 primary pain medications from the local doc: opium, morphine, and good old whiskey. There's more than a few written records of doctors during the war partaking in a little whiskey themselves at the end of the day. The surgical tents were the most chaotic spots in the whole camp. This is where the most urgent cases would be. Men brought back from the battlefield with grievous wounds. Gunshots from many ball rifles were serious news. These new weapons dealt more damage than the musket ball, tearing through the body and sometimes lodging themselves in bone and muscle. Patients would get a dose of anesthetic in the form of chloroform on a cloth, held over their nose and mouth until they fell unconscious. Medics would probe wounds with their fingers in search of bullets and shrapnel, removing them by hand and doing their best to clean the debris from the wound before suturing it shut. Some injuries were too serious for just sutures. Say, for example, a soldier got really unlucky and took a cannonball to the leg. Well, doctors in those days couldn't put that back together. That might be a tough day even. In these cases, doctors resorted to amputations with the aim to give a soldier a greater chance at survival. It was the only way to prevent infection and gangrene from setting in. A fresh wound from an amputation was less at risk than a messy, unfixable battlefield injury. Throughout the war, over 60,000 amputations were performed, almost 3/4 of all the surgeries. Some doctors performed so many amputations that they were eventually able to perform them in a mere 10 minutes. And despite the gross and gruesome conditions, these amputations had a pretty good success rate, all things considered, with 75% of all patients surviving. Once a soldier makes it through surgery and they're stable and safe to move, they get to leave the front lines and head back to a general hospital. These hospitals are a much nicer place than the field hospitals, which is great because they're going to spend weeks or even months recovering there. At the end of their hospital stay, if they're fighting fit, they'll head back to the front lines. Some might be discharged if their injuries were serious enough, and if their condition fell somewhere in between, the Army had the Invalid Corps, not a name that would be particularly well received today, where they could find work as guards or clerks. The general hospitals these men recovered at were fully equipped, a far cry from the field camps and hospitals they spent time at on the battlefield. There were kitchens, laundries, storerooms with everything they needed, and many amenities. Some of these hospitals had chapels, bakeries, or even their own mail rooms. Daily life was monotonous, but safe. Everything was performed to a precise military schedule, but often nurses found time to stop and talk with the men to provide company and comfort. Often they helped to write letters to their friends and family. When nurses were unavailable, many of the soldiers talked with each other, and many of them lent their hand to their neighbors when it came to letter writing, since this was the only way many of them had to keep in touch with their family. Now, these general hospitals weren't perfect. There was still the risk of contracting the diseases and illnesses that claimed lives out in the field hospitals. In fact, many of the patients at these hospitals were being treated not just for battle wounds, but for diseases such as dysentery, measles, malaria, or typhoid. But with well-trained staff, proper supplies, and an enclosed environment, these hospitals were a far better environment than the dirt and despair of field hospitals. Altogether, the doctors were much better equipped to follow the hygiene regulations set by the medical department. Any soldier who made it out of the front lines was definitely grateful to make his recovery in one of these general hospitals. Looking back, the Civil War was incredibly demanding of its doctors. Those medics had their hands full, dealing with an endless list of problems that give anyone a headache. They weren't working with much: limited knowledge, rusty tools, and reused bandages. With questionable hygiene and no knowledge of germ theory, field hospitals were like a petri dish of trouble. Surgeons relied on amputations just to keep infections at bay. Imagine surgeries outdoors, knives instead of scalpels, and barely any time to wash up between patients. You have to keep in mind that these doctors were trying to make the best of the worst, and what they did in some ways was pretty incredible. So, as we look back, let's tip our hats to those medics and nurses who held it together in the midst of chaos, making do with what they had to help soldiers survive the Civil War.